The slap echoed through first class so loud it silenced the clinking glasses. A flight attendant stood over Evelyn Carter, her voice cold as ice. "This seat isn't for you." Torn pieces of a boarding pass fluttered to the carpet like trash, landing at Evelyn's feet. 30 people watched. No one stood up. No one said a word. Phones came out. Heads turned away. A quiet whisper slid through the cabin. "She doesn't belong here." But Evelyn didn't kneel, didn't argue, didn't even raise her voice. She just sat there, back straight, hands calm in her lap, a faint red mark rising on her cheek under the soft cabin lights. And for a brief second, just a second, one torn piece of paper flipped over near her shoe. 2 words caught the light. Legacy access. No one noticed. No one cared. Except Evelyn. Because in less than 10 minutes, the same people who watched her humiliation in silence were about to realize something terrifying. They hadn't just insulted a stranger. They had just humiliated someone who could bring this entire airline to its knees. The first-class cabin glowed in soft, expensive light. Champagne flutes caught reflections from overhead panels, casting warm glimmers across polished wood and leather seats. The air smelled faintly of citrus and cologne, the quiet murmur of privilege settling in before takeoff. Evelyn Carter stepped into that space like she didn't belong to it. And yet, she walked with a calm that didn't ask permission. Her cardigan was worn at the cuffs. Her sneakers had seen too many miles. In a room filled with tailored suits and designer handbags, she looked like a mistake someone hadn't corrected yet. She checked the number on her boarding pass again. 2A. Then she slid her small carry-on gently into the overhead bin and lowered herself into the seat. For a brief second, nothing happened. Then the voice came. Sharp, cold, immediate. "Ma'am, you need to get up." Evelyn looked up to see the flight attendant standing in the aisle. Lauren Brooks, perfectly styled hair, lipstick precise, smile gone. "This seat isn't for you." A few heads turned. Not all. Just enough. Evelyn blinked once. Slow, steady. "I believe it is," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I paid for this seat." Lauren didn't even look at the boarding pass yet. Her eyes had already made the decision. "No," she said flatly, "you didn't." A man across the aisle shifted in his seat, adjusting his watch like this had nothing to do with him. A woman near the window pulled her handbag closer. Evelyn held out the boarding pass. "You can check it." Lauren took it, but not like it mattered. Her eyes flicked over it for less than a second before she let out a short, dismissive laugh. "I've been doing this job long enough," she said, raising her voice just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I know a fake when I see one." A couple of quiet chuckles followed. Not loud, not proud, just enough. Evelyn didn't move. "Ma'am," she said again, softer this time. "Please look again." That was when Lauren's hand moved, fast. A sharp crack split through the cabin. The sound was louder than anyone expected. It cut through conversation, through music, through the soft hum of the aircraft like something breaking that couldn't be put back together. Evelyn's head turned slightly with the impact. Not violently, just enough to show it landed. The room froze. No one spoke. No one stood. Lauren's expression didn't change. If anything, it hardened. "That's what happens," she said, her voice low but cutting, "when people think they can lie their way into places they don't belong." She tore the boarding pass in half, then again and again. Small pieces fluttered down, landing at Evelyn's feet like confetti no one wanted to celebrate. Pick it up, Lauren said, pointing toward the floor, and then you can make your way back to economy. The silence deepened. Phones began to rise, slowly at first, then more. Recording, watching, waiting. Evelyn didn't bend. Her cheek burned. A faint red mark spread across her dark skin, sharp against the soft cabin lighting. But her posture didn't change. Her hands rested gently in her lap. Her breathing stayed even. She looked down, not at the woman standing over her, but at the pieces of paper on the floor. One of them had flipped face up. A corner of the print was still visible. Access. The rest was torn. She stared at it for a moment, then lifted her eyes again. Around her, 30 people sat in seats that cost more than most monthly rent payments. None of them moved. None of them spoke. One man cleared his throat and looked away. Another passenger adjusted her sunglasses, though the cabin lights hadn't changed. Someone near the back whispered, "Finally, someone's dealing with it." Evelyn heard it. She heard all of it. And still, she didn't move. Lauren shifted her weight impatiently. "I'm not asking again." Evelyn's voice, when it came, was steady, not loud, not shaking. "I paid for this seat." The words hung in the air, not as a challenge, not as a plea, just a fact. Lauren let out a short, humorless laugh. "Sure you did." She turned slightly, addressing the nearby passengers now, as if they were part of something shared. "This is exactly why flights get delayed," she said. "People thinking rules don't apply to them." A few nods, a few murmurs. Agreement without responsibility. Evelyn remained seated, still, quiet, unmoved. The pieces of her ticket stayed on the floor, and for reasons no one in that cabin could explain yet. She did not look like someone who had just lost. She looked like someone who was waiting. For what? No one knew. But something in the air had changed, just slightly. Like a shift you only notice right before everything else does. And somewhere in that silence, a question began to form. If she wasn't moving, then what did she know that no one else did? The plane hadn't even left the gate yet, but something had already begun, and no one in that cabin was ready for what was about to happen next. The air inside first class shifted in a way that couldn't be seen, only felt. It lingered in the pause after the slap, in the stillness of 30 people pretending not to notice what had just taken place. The overhead lights hummed softly, steady and indifferent, casting the same warm glow on polished shoes and trembling hands alike. Evelyn Carter did not move. Not when the torn pieces of her boarding pass lay scattered across the carpet. Not when Lauren Brooks stood over her, waiting for compliance like it was owed. Not even when the silence around her thickened into something heavy and uncomfortable. She remained seated, her back straight, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her breathing measured, steady, almost unnervingly calm. The red mark on her cheek deepened slowly, blooming beneath the surface of her skin. Anyone looking directly at her could see it clearly now, but most people weren't looking directly at her. They were looking just past her, or down at their phones, or out the window where the airport lights blinked against the late afternoon sky. Anywhere but at the truth sitting in seat 2A. "Did you not hear me?" Lauren snapped, her voice rising just enough to cut through the low murmur of the cabin. Evelyn lifted her eyes. Not sharply, not defiantly. Just enough. "I heard you," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't carry anger or fear. It simply existed, quiet and grounded, like it had no need to prove anything. Lauren let out a short breath through her nose, half laugh, half irritation. Then why are you still sitting there? Evelyn glanced briefly at the floor, at the scattered fragments of her ticket, then back up again. Because, she said gently, this is my seat. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. One man in a navy suit adjusted his cufflinks, avoiding eye contact. A woman across the aisle lowered her sunglasses just slightly, studying Evelyn for a moment before looking away again. Somewhere behind them, a phone camera clicked softly as someone adjusted their angle. Lauren shook her head, her patience thinning visibly. No, it isn't, she said, and you're making this harder than it needs to be. She took a step closer, lowering her voice, but not enough to hide the edge in it. You need to pick that up, she said, pointing again at the floor. And you need to move. Evelyn followed the direction of her finger. The pieces of paper lay scattered like something broken beyond repair. One small corner had flipped slightly, the printed ink catching the light just enough to show a fragment of text. She noticed it. Her eyes lingered there for half a second longer than expected. Then she looked back up. I will, she said softly, in a moment. Lauren blinked, caught off guard, not by resistance, but by the absence of it. There was no argument, no raised voice, no pleading, just delay. And somehow, that unsettled her more. In a moment? Lauren repeated, her tone sharpening. No, ma'am. You do it now. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she shifted her hands slightly, smoothing the fabric of her cardigan at the wrists. The motion was small, almost absent-minded, but deliberate in its calm, the kind of movement someone makes when they refuse to be rushed. I understand you're upset, Evelyn said after a beat. That was when a ripple of reaction moved through the nearby seats. Not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle shift, because no one expected that sentence. Not here, not now. Lauren's eyebrows lifted. I'm not upset, she snapped. I'm doing my job. Evelyn nodded once. Of course. There was no sarcasm in it, no challenge, just acknowledgement. And that made it worse. Lauren's jaw tightened. She straightened slightly, aware now of the phones pointed in her direction, the quiet attention of the room pressing in. This is exactly what I'm talking about, she said, raising her voice again so others could hear. People who think they can just sit wherever they want and then act like... I didn't sit wherever I wanted, Evelyn interrupted, still calm. Her voice didn't rise, but it landed. I sat where I was assigned. The sentence settled into the space between them. Simple, clear, unmoving. Lauren laughed, louder this time, inviting agreement. Assigned? She echoed. By who? A man 2 rows back chuckled under his breath. Someone else murmured, Unbelievable. Evelyn didn't look at them. She didn't turn toward the laughter or the whispers. Her focus stayed on Lauren, steady and patient, as if the rest of the cabin didn't exist. By the airline, she said. Lauren took a step back, crossing her arms loosely. Right, she said. And I'm supposed to just believe that. Evelyn didn't respond. Not right away. Instead, she glanced once more at the floor, at the torn pieces, at that same fragment catching the light. Access. It was barely visible, barely readable, but it was there. And for the briefest moment, something in Evelyn's expression shifted. Not fear, not anger, something quieter, something that looked almost like recognition. Then it was gone. Lauren followed her gaze, but only for a second before dismissing it entirely. Enough, she said, her tone flattening. You're holding up boarding. She turned her head toward the front of the cabin. I'm going to call my supervisor, she added, loud enough for others to hear. A few passengers nodded, relieved that something was being done. Finally, order restored, consequences delivered. Evelyn remained seated, still, composed. As if the outcome of that decision had already been accounted for somewhere she didn't need to explain. Lauren reached for the intercom panel near the galley, pressing a button with practiced ease. "Daniel," she said into it, her voice clipped. "I need you in first class. We've got a situation." The word lingered. Situation. Not mistake, not misunderstanding. A situation. Evelyn's hands rested quietly in her lap. Her fingers moved once, lightly brushing against each other, as if counting time no one else could see. Around her, the cabin settled into a different kind of silence now. Not the stunned quiet after the slap, not the awkward avoidance that followed. This was something else. Expectation. The sense that something was building, even if no one could quite name what. A woman near the aisle leaned toward her husband. "This is going to get her kicked off," she whispered. Her husband nodded. "Should have just moved," he muttered. Evelyn heard them. She heard everything. And still, she did not move. Because somewhere between the moment that hand struck her face and the moment now unfolding, she had already made a decision. Not about the seat, not about the argument, but about herself. About what she would and would not do in a room that had already decided who she was. She would not kneel. She would not scramble for approval. She would not shrink to fit their assumptions. She would sit. And she would wait. At the front of the cabin, a figure appeared, moving quickly down the aisle. Tall, broad-shouldered, purposeful. Daniel Reed, supervisor, authority. And as he approached, the energy in the cabin tightened again. Because whatever happened next would decide everything. Evelyn lifted her eyes once more, meeting the moment without hesitation. And for the first time since this began, a question flickered, not in her, but in the room itself. What if they were wrong? What if she wasn't who they thought she was? And if that was true, what had they just done? The question hung in the air, unspoken, barely formed, like something fragile that no one wanted to touch. Daniel Reed slowed his pace as he approached. He had seen situations before, passengers arguing over seats, misunderstandings about upgrades, even the occasional heated exchange. But something about this felt different, not louder, not bigger, just off. He stopped beside Lauren, his presence filling the narrow aisle with quiet authority. His jacket was crisp, his tie perfectly centered, his expression trained into that careful balance between professionalism and impatience. "What's going on?" he asked, keeping his voice level. Lauren didn't hesitate. "Seat fraud," she said immediately. She refused to move, got confrontational, and wouldn't provide valid documentation. Daniel's eyes moved to Evelyn for the first time. He didn't see her face. He saw the cardigan, the worn sneakers, the stillness, and something in his posture settled into a conclusion before a single word was exchanged. "Ma'am," he said, turning slightly toward her, "I'm going to need you to stand up." Evelyn looked at him. Not up at him, not down. Just at him. Her eyes were steady, dark and clear, carrying something deeper than the moment in front of them. "I'd like you to look at my ticket," she said. Her voice was calm enough to feel out of place. Daniel glanced briefly at the floor where the torn pieces lay scattered. "I'm told it's not valid," he replied. "It is," Evelyn said. A pause. Then Daniel exhaled lightly, as if this was already taking longer than necessary. "Ma'am, we can sort this out at the gate," he said. "But right now, you need to come with me." Around them, the cabin shifted again. The tension wasn't sharp anymore. It was heavy, like something sinking. A man near the aisle leaned toward his neighbor. "They're going to take her off," he whispered. His neighbor nodded. Should have just followed instructions. Phones were still up. Recording. Always recording. Evelyn's hands moved slowly, resting against the fabric of her skirt this time. Her fingers traced a faint line along the seam, almost absent-mindedly. "I understand you have procedures," she said. Daniel gave a small nod. "Then you understand why we need you to cooperate." Evelyn held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she did something that no one in that cabin expected. She smiled. It wasn't wide. It wasn't defiant. It was small, almost private, like a memory passing through her before settling back into place. "I've spent most of my life cooperating," she said quietly. The sentence didn't sound like an argument. It sounded like history. And for a brief second, Daniel hesitated. Not enough to change course, but enough to notice something he couldn't quite name. Behind them, the soft murmur of voices returned, blending with the distant hum of the engines warming up outside. The overhead bins clicked shut. A flight attendant further down the aisle moved briskly, pretending not to watch. Everything was continuing, as if nothing had happened, as if something hadn't already broken. Evelyn shifted slightly in her seat, her eyes drifting toward the window for just a moment. The airport lights outside flickered against the glass, and for a brief second, they became something else. Something older, something quieter. Detroit. The memory came back not as a story, but as a feeling. Cold air pushing through cracked window frames, neon signs flickering outside corner stores, the low hum of traffic echoing through streets that never really slept. Evelyn stood behind a folding table in a small community kitchen, her hands wrapped around a metal ladle, steam rising from a pot of soup that never seemed big enough. "You make sure the kids get seconds," she had told a young volunteer once. "Grown folks can wait." She had said it with a smile, always with a smile. Because the truth was, she had learned early that dignity wasn't something given. It was something you held on to, even when everything else slipped away. Her son had been 10 the first time he asked her why she never kept the good portions for herself. "Because you don't build a future by taking from people who have less," she told him. He didn't understand then. Not really. But he remembered. Years later, when the lights stayed on longer, when the rent stopped being a question every month, when his name started appearing on buildings instead of envelopes, he still remembered. Back in the cabin, Evelyn blinked once. The memory faded. The present returned. Daniel cleared his throat lightly, bringing the moment back into focus. "Ma'am," he said again, a little firmer this time, "I need you to stand." Evelyn looked down at the floor once more, at the torn pieces, at the fragment that still caught the light. Access. Her fingers moved slightly, as if she might reach for it, then stopped. Instead, she lifted her eyes again. "I will," she said. Lauren shifted impatiently beside Daniel. "Then do it," she snapped. But Evelyn didn't move yet. Not physically, not outwardly. Because something inside her had already settled. A decision. Not about leaving, not about arguing, but about timing. Because for the first time since she sat down, she understood exactly where this was going. And more importantly, she understood exactly where it would end. A soft vibration came from her bag, barely noticeable, but she felt it. She didn't reach for it, not yet. Around her, the room continued to close in. The judgment, the assumptions, the quiet agreement that whatever happened next was justified, that she deserved it, that she belonged somewhere else. Evelyn let that settle. Let it exist. Let them have it. Because there was something they didn't understand. Something they couldn't see. Not in her clothes. Not in her posture. Not in the calm that held her steady when everything around her tried to shake her loose. And as Daniel stepped forward, ready to take control of the situation, a different kind of question began to rise. Not from Evelyn, not from Lauren, but from somewhere deeper in the room. What if they had already gone too far? And if they had, was there any way back? The question lingered in the space between people who refused to ask it out loud. Daniel Reed stepped closer, his polished shoes brushing softly against the carpet, where fragments of Evelyn's boarding pass still lay scattered. Each piece looked small, harmless, almost meaningless, but together they told a story no one had bothered to read. "Ma'am," he said again, firmer now, "we're not going to keep repeating this." His voice had shifted, less patient, more procedural, the kind of tone that came from someone who had already made a decision and was now simply following through. Evelyn looked at him. She didn't look intimidated. She didn't look defiant. She looked present. Fully present in a moment that everyone else seemed eager to rush past. "I understand," she said, and she meant it. Daniel nodded once, taking that as compliance. "Good," he replied. "Then let's go ahead and—" "She hasn't shown you anything," a voice cut in suddenly. It wasn't loud, it wasn't confident, but it was enough to make Daniel pause. The voice came from a young woman standing a few rows back in the galley. Another flight attendant. Newer, less polished, her uniform just slightly out of alignment in ways that suggested she hadn't been wearing it for years yet. Her name tag read, Megan. Lauren turned sharply. "Excuse me?" Megan hesitated. Her eyes flicked to Evelyn, then to the floor, then back up again. I mean, she started, her voice faltering under the weight of the room's attention. "We didn't actually check the ticket properly." Lauren's expression tightened instantly. "I checked it," she snapped. Megan swallowed. "It was just really quick. I thought maybe—" "You thought wrong," Lauren cut in. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. Because now, for the first time, doubt had been spoken. Small, fragile, but real. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, glancing between them. "Lauren, did you verify the ticket through the system?" he asked. Lauren crossed her arms. "I don't need to run every obvious fake through a scanner to know what it is." There was a ripple of agreement from a few passengers. Subtle nods. Quiet murmurs. Confirmation without responsibility. Daniel exhaled, clearly weighing time against thoroughness. Boarding was nearly complete. The gate clock ticked down. Delays cost money. Decisions had to be made. "We don't have time for this," he said finally. "We'll handle it at the gate." Megan's shoulders dropped slightly. She didn't push again, not because she was convinced, but because she understood her place. And in that moment, so did everyone else. Everyone except Evelyn. Evelyn hadn't moved. Not an inch. Not a shift in posture. Not even a change in expression. She had heard the hesitation. She had seen the flicker of doubt. And still, she remained exactly where she was. "Ma'am," Daniel said, turning back to her, "I'm asking you one last time. Please stand." Evelyn's gaze drifted briefly past him, toward Megan. For just a second, their eyes met. Something passed between them. Not words, not even understanding. Just recognition. Then Evelyn looked back at Daniel. "I will," she said again, The same words, the same tone, but something in the way she said it now felt different, more final, more chosen. Lauren let out a frustrated breath. "Then do it," she said, stepping slightly aside as if clearing the path. The aisle opened. All eyes followed. Evelyn placed her hands on the armrests of her seat. Slowly, carefully. She began to rise. Not hurried, not reluctant, just deliberate. The movement drew the entire cabin into a kind of quiet focus. Because now, finally, something was happening. Resolution, control, order restored. That's what it looked like. That's what it felt like. Evelyn stood. For a moment, she remained there beside her seat, her posture upright, her chin level, her presence steady in a way that didn't match the story being told about her. Then she looked down again. At the floor, at the torn pieces of paper, at that same fragment. Access. This time she bent, not quickly, not submissively, but with intention. Her fingers reached toward the piece, paused just above it, then gently picked it up. The paper was creased, edges jagged where it had been torn without care. She turned it slightly between her fingers. The light caught the ink again. Clearer now. Legacy access. For the briefest moment, something flickered behind her eyes. Not surprise. Not confusion. Something closer to confirmation. Then she straightened, the piece of paper still in her hand. Lauren watched, arms crossed, a faint smirk returning to her lips. "There you go," she said. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" A few passengers chuckled quietly. Relief, tension releasing, the situation resolving exactly as expected. Evelyn didn't respond. She simply held the fragment, her thumb brushing lightly over the printed words as if feeling something deeper than ink and paper. Daniel gestured toward the aisle. "This way, ma'am." Evelyn nodded. She took one step forward, then another. The cabin parted for her, not out of respect, but out of avoidance. No one touched her, no one stopped her, no one spoke. They simply let her pass, as if the story was already over, as if the outcome had already been decided. But as she moved down the aisle, something else began to happen. Phones lowered, just slightly. Eyes lingered, a little longer than before, because something didn't feel finished. Not quite. Evelyn reached the front of the cabin, near the galley, near the narrow space that separated first class from the rest of the plane. And then she stopped. Not because she was told to, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she chose to. Daniel frowned slightly. "Ma'am?" Evelyn turned. Slowly. Facing the cabin again. Facing the people who had watched, who had recorded, who had decided. Her hand lifted slightly, the small torn fragment still between her fingers. "I think," she said gently, "you should take another look at this." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Because now, for the first time, people were actually listening. Lauren rolled her eyes. "We've already been through that," she said. But Daniel didn't dismiss it immediately this time. Something in the room had shifted. Just enough. He stepped closer, extending his hand. Evelyn placed the fragment into it. He glanced down. At first it meant nothing. Just a piece of paper. Just part of a ticket. Then his eyes focused. The words sharpened. Legacy access. His expression didn't change immediately, but something in his posture did. A slight stillness. A pause that didn't belong there. Lauren noticed it. "It's nothing," she said quickly. "Just part of the print." "Where's the rest?" Daniel asked quietly. The question landed heavier than it should have, because suddenly, it mattered. Lauren hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then shrugged. On the floor, I guess. Daniel looked down the aisle, at the scattered pieces, at the evidence no one had cared about minutes ago. And for the first time since this began, the story wasn't as clear as it had seemed. Evelyn watched him, not with urgency, not with expectation, just patience. Because she knew something they didn't, something she hadn't said, something she didn't need to say yet. And as the cabin held its breath once more, a new question began to form. Not about her, but about everything that had just happened. What if they hadn't just made a mistake? What if they had made the wrong kind of mistake? The kind that doesn't go away, no matter how quickly you try to fix it. The cabin didn't move, not physically, but something inside it shifted again. Deeper this time, quieter, harder to ignore. Daniel Reed still held the torn fragment in his hand. Legacy access. 2 words. Nothing more. Nothing less. But they didn't belong in the story he had already decided was true. He looked down at it again, slower now, as if the meaning might change if he gave it more time. It didn't. Behind him, Lauren crossed her arms tighter, her voice cutting through the hesitation. "It doesn't mean anything," she said. "People print all kinds of things on fake tickets now." Her tone was confident. Too confident. The kind that didn't leave room for doubt, even when doubt had already entered the room. Daniel didn't answer her right away. Instead, he turned slightly, scanning the aisle. The pieces of the ticket were still scattered across the carpet. A few near the seat. A few further down, where someone's shoe had nudged them without noticing. Evidence. Ignored. Discarded. Conveniently overlooked. "Pick up the rest," he said quietly. Lauren frowned. "Why?" Daniel didn't look at her. "Because I said so." The shift was small, almost invisible, but it was there. Authority moving. Not away from her, not fully, but not standing beside her the same way it had before. Lauren hesitated, then bent down with a sharp, irritated motion, gathering the pieces one by one. Her movements weren't careful, they weren't respectful, they were quick, dismissive, as if the act itself was unnecessary, as if she was humoring something that didn't deserve attention. Around them, the passengers watched, not openly, not directly, but enough. The phones were still out, though some had lowered slightly, no longer held as high. A man in the second row leaned forward, whispering to the woman beside him. "Why are they even bothering?" he said. "It's obvious." She nodded, though her eyes flicked toward Evelyn for just a second longer than before. "It should be," she murmured. But the certainty in her voice had softened. Evelyn stood near the front of the cabin, just beyond the dividing line, where first class ended and the rest of the plane began. She hadn't taken another step, not forward, not back. She simply waited. Her hands rested gently at her sides now, empty, her face calm, her cheeks still marked, but her posture unchanged. There was no urgency in her, no need to prove anything, no need to rush, because the moment had already begun to turn. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Lauren returned with the pieces, holding them loosely in one hand. "Here," she said, placing them into Daniel's palm with more force than necessary. Daniel took them, carefully this time. He didn't rush, didn't dismiss. He started aligning the edges, piece by piece, like something fragile that might fall apart if handled too roughly. The cabin grew quieter, Because now people were watching differently, not for entertainment, not for validation, but for clarity. The truth, whatever it was no longer invisible. It was assembling. Daniel turned one piece slightly, then another. The printed lines began to connect, fragments forming something whole, not yet complete, but closer. His brow tightened. Just slightly. What does that even prove? Lauren said, her voice sharper now, cutting into the quiet like something breaking under pressure. It's still just paper. No one answered her. Not Daniel, not the passengers, not even Megan. Because something else had entered the space. Something heavier than confidence. Something closer to doubt. A man in the third row cleared his throat, then quickly looked away when no one acknowledged him. A woman near the aisle lowered her phone completely, resting it in her lap. Another passenger shifted uncomfortably, crossing and uncrossing his legs as if the seat no longer felt as secure as it had moments ago. The room was changing, not outwardly, but underneath. Evelyn watched it happen, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, just awareness. Because she had seen this before, in different rooms, in different forms. That moment when certainty cracks, not all at once, but in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. And once it cracks, it never quite goes back the same. Daniel looked up briefly, at Evelyn. Then back down again. His hands moved slower now, more careful, as if he understood, at least on some level, that whatever he was holding wasn't just a ticket. It was something else. Something that didn't fit the story he had been told. Lauren stepped closer, her voice lowering but tightening with impatience. "Daniel, we're delaying the flight," she said. "We don't have time for this." He didn't respond. Not immediately. Instead, he turned another piece, aligned another edge. And for a brief second, the cabin held its breath. Because now it mattered. Not just to Evelyn, not just to Lauren, but to everyone who had watched, who had assumed, who had agreed without saying a word. If this was wrong, then everything that followed it was wrong too. And that was harder to face than anyone wanted to admit. Evelyn shifted her weight slightly, just enough to ease the pressure on her feet. Her eyes moved once more across the cabin. 30 faces, 30 stories, 30 people who had made a choice. Not to act, not to question, not to intervene, just to watch. And now, to wait. Because the truth, whatever it was no longer something they could ignore. It was right there, in Daniel's hands. And as he fitted another piece into place, a new question settled over the room. Not whispered, not spoken, but felt. What if the problem was never her? The question didn't echo out loud. It didn't need to. It settled into the cabin like a pressure change, subtle, but impossible to ignore once it began. Daniel Reed's fingers slowed as he worked the torn pieces together. The edges didn't fit perfectly. Some were missing. Others were bent where they had been crushed under careless shoes. But enough of it remained. Enough to form something recognizable. A boarding pass. A real one. Not the clean, untouched version that came straight from a printer, but a damaged truth, pieced together in front of 30 witnesses who hadn't asked for it. Daniel's eyes moved across the partial lines. Name, seat number, flight code, all aligning, all real. His jaw tightened. Behind him, Lauren shifted again, impatience sharpening into something closer to discomfort. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice louder now, reaching for control that was slipping just out of reach. You can't verify anything from scraps like that. But her words didn't land the same way anymore. Not because they were wrong, but because they weren't certain. Daniel didn't look at her. He turned another piece, smoothed it down. And there it was again. That same phrase, clearer now. Legacy access. This time he didn't ignore it. He stared at it. For a second too long. What does that even mean? Lauren pressed, stepping closer, her tone edged with something defensive now. It's just marketing language. Doesn't prove anything. Daniel exhaled slowly. It means something, he said. Not loudly, not definitively, but enough. And that was all it took, because now the doubt wasn't just in the room. It had a voice. A man across the aisle leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed. Is that some kind of upgrade? He asked, half to himself, half to anyone listening. No one answered, because no one knew. And suddenly, that mattered. Evelyn stood where she had stopped, near the front of the cabin. Still, quiet, watching. She didn't step forward, didn't push the moment. She simply allowed it to unfold. Because truth, she had learned, didn't need to be forced. It just needed space. And eventually, it spoke for itself. Megan shifted in the galley, her hands twisting together nervously. I've seen that before, she said softly. Every head within earshot turned. Lauren's eyes snapped toward her. Where? Megan hesitated, suddenly aware of how many people were listening now. I think it's part of a special category, she said. Like long-term loyalty or something tied to corporate accounts. Lauren scoffed. You think, she repeated. Megan swallowed. I'm not sure, but I don't think it's fake. The word landed. Fake. The label that had defined everything from the start. Now, uncertain. Daniel looked up again. At Evelyn. At the calm in her posture. At the absence of panic. And for the first time, he asked a question he should have asked from the beginning. Ma'am, he said, his tone shifting. Not softer, but different. Where did you purchase this ticket? Evelyn met his gaze. Through the airline, she said. Simple. Direct. Nothing added. Nothing hidden. Lauren let out a short, strained laugh. Of course she did. But even that sounded thinner now, less convincing. Daniel didn't respond to her. Instead, he looked down again at the reconstructed pieces, then back up, then down again, as if weighing something, as if recalculating. Around them, the cabin had changed. The phones were still there, but no longer raised high in confidence. Now they hovered, uncertain. Some lowered entirely. Others remained, but with a different intent, not to capture proof of wrongdoing, but to capture whatever came next. Because now, no one was sure what that would be. A woman near the window leaned toward her husband again. Something's off, she whispered. He didn't answer right away. Because for the first time since this began, he wasn't sure which side he was on. Evelyn shifted her weight slightly. Her hand moved, not toward the ticket pieces, not toward her bag. Just a small adjustment. A reminder that she was still here. Still present. Still part of a story that had tried to move past her without understanding her. Daniel straightened slowly. The pieces of the boarding pass still in his hand. His posture changed, subtly, but noticeably. Because now, he wasn't managing a disruption. He was facing a possibility. And those were far more dangerous. We're going to verify this, he said. Lauren blinked. No. Daniel cut in, not sharply, but firmly. We're going to verify it properly. The words settled heavily, because they carried something new. Not certainty, but accountability. Lauren's expression shifted again. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to unease. That's going to delay the flight, she said. Daniel nodded once. Then we delay it. A quiet ripple moved through the passengers. Delay. Now it affected them. Now it mattered. A man checked his watch. Another sighed under his breath. But no one objected out loud, because something else had become more important. The truth, or at least, the need for it. Daniel turned slightly toward the galley. Call it in, he said. Megan nodded quickly, moving to the intercom. Her hands trembled just enough to notice, because she understood what this meant. Not just for Evelyn, but for everyone. Evelyn watched her, watched the shift, watched the moment turn. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Because the story had changed. It was no longer about removing her. It was about figuring out whether she should have ever been questioned at all. And that was a very different kind of story. The kind that didn't end quietly. The kind that didn't stay contained. The kind that spread. Daniel looked back at Evelyn one more time. And this time, there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not respect. Not yet. But something close to it. A recognition. That he might be standing in the middle of something bigger than he had assumed. And as the call went through, as the system on the other end prepared to respond, a new realization began to take shape. If she was right, then none of this was supposed to happen. Not the slap, not the accusation, not the silence. And if that was true, then what else had they missed? The thought settled into the cabin like a slow-moving storm. No thunder, no lightning. Just a quiet pressure building behind every glance, every breath, every second that stretched longer than it should have. Megan's voice came softly through the intercom, steady but careful. Ground support. This is Flight 218. First-class verification request. We need immediate confirmation on a passenger ticket under Carter, Evelyn. The words echoed faintly through the speaker, mechanical and distant. Then silence. Waiting. Daniel stood still, the reconstructed pieces of the boarding pass in his hand, his attention fixed on the response that hadn't come yet. Lauren didn't wait. She couldn't. Her composure had started to crack in ways she didn't fully understand. "This is unnecessary," she said sharply, stepping closer again. "We already know what this is. You're letting this drag out for no reason." Daniel didn't answer. Not this time. Because now he wasn't listening to her. He was listening to the silence. The kind that feels like something is about to arrive. Behind them, a low murmur returned. Different now, unsettled. Passengers shifted in their seats. A man in the second row uncrossed his legs, then crossed them again, restless. A woman who had been filming lowered her phone slightly, her thumb hovering over the screen as if unsure whether to keep recording or stop entirely. Something had changed. They could feel it, but they didn't yet understand it. Lauren turned toward Evelyn again, her voice tightening. "You're holding up an entire flight," she said. "Do you understand that?" Evelyn met her gaze. "I understand a lot of things," she replied quietly. The answer didn't raise her voice, but it carried. Because it didn't sound defensive, it sounded complete. Lauren let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. Unbelievable. She turned slightly, addressing the cabin again like she needed the room to agree with her. "This is exactly what I was talking about," she said. People who don't respect the system, who think they can just... She didn't disrespect anything. The voice came from behind them. Not Megan this time. A passenger. An older man, seated 2 rows back, his posture stiff, his expression guarded. Lauren blinked. "Excuse me?" The man hesitated, just for a second, then straightened slightly. "You didn't check the ticket," he said. "Not really." The words were careful, measured, but they landed. Lauren's eyes narrowed. "Sir, I've been doing this for... I know," he cut in, not raising his voice but not backing down either. "You said that." A pause, a shift. The room leaned in, not physically but in attention, because now the silence had broken. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Lauren turned fully toward him now, disbelief flickering across her face. "Are you seriously questioning how I do my job right now?" The man didn't answer immediately. He looked at Evelyn, at the mark on her cheek, at the pieces of paper in Daniel's hand, then back at Lauren. "I'm questioning what I just saw," he said, and just like that, the balance tipped. Not all the way, not yet, but enough to feel it. Lauren laughed, but it sounded thinner now. "You saw someone trying to take a seat that isn't theirs." "Did I?" the man replied. Another pause, another shift. Because now the room wasn't unified anymore. It was dividing. Some still leaned toward Lauren. Others weren't so sure. Evelyn stood in the middle of it all, untouched by the movement around her. Her calm remained intact, her presence steady, like a fixed point in a room that was starting to spin. Daniel glanced toward the intercom. Still no response. His fingers tightened slightly around the paper. Time stretched, every second longer than it should have been. Then, a sharp sound broke through it, the distant click of footsteps moving quickly down the aisle behind them. Heavy, purposeful, security. 2 uniformed officers appeared at the entrance to first class, their presence immediate, their posture controlled. The room reacted instantly, a collective intake of breath, because now it had escalated. Lauren turned toward them, relief flooding her expression. Finally, she said, "We need assistance removing a passenger." The officers stepped forward, scanning the scene with practiced eyes. Daniel straightened, his voice measured again. "We're verifying the situation," he said. One of the officers nodded, but his attention shifted to Evelyn. Always back to her. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "we're going to need you to step with us." The words were professional, neutral, but final. The kind of words that ended things. The kind that didn't leave room for debate. The room stilled again. Because this was the line. Evelyn looked at him, not afraid, not angry, just aware. "I will," she said softly. The same answer, the same calm. But something about it felt heavier now, because everyone understood what it meant. Not compliance, not surrender, timing. Lauren crossed her arms again, her confidence returning just slightly. "There we go," she said under her breath. "Order restored. Or at least, that's what it looked like." Evelyn took one small step forward, then stopped. Again. The officers exchanged a brief glance. "Ma'am?" one of them prompted. Evelyn tilted her head just slightly. "Before I go," she said, her voice calm, steady, unshaken by everything surrounding her, "I'd like to make a phone call." Lauren let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You can make all the calls you want after you get off the plane." Evelyn didn't look at her. She looked at the officer. "I won't take long," she said. The officer hesitated, just for a moment, because something in her tone didn't match the situation. It didn't sound like a delay. It didn't sound like an excuse. It sounded like a step, a necessary one. Daniel watched closely. The room held its breath. Because now, this was no longer about a seat. It was about what came next, and whether anyone in that cabin was ready for it. The officer nodded slowly. "Make it quick." Evelyn inclined her head once in quiet acknowledgement. Then, for the first time since all of this began, she reached into her bag. The movement was slow, careful. Every eye in the room followed it, not because they expected danger, but because they didn't know what to expect at all. Her fingers disappeared inside the worn leather. For a second, nothing. Then, a faint metallic glint caught the overhead light. Just a flash, gone as quickly as it appeared. No one spoke. No one breathed too loudly, because whatever was about to happen next was going to change everything. Evelyn's hand emerged from her bag slowly, deliberately, not rushed, not hesitant, just precise. Her fingers wrapped around a small, older model phone, the kind without shine, without decoration, without anything that suggested importance. It didn't match the moment. It didn't match the room. And yet somehow, it did. She held it for a second, as if feeling its weight. Not physical weight, something deeper. Then she looked up, at the officer. "I won't be long," she said again. The officer nodded once. Lauren exhaled sharply, turning away with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Go ahead," she muttered. "Call whoever you think is going to fix this." A few passengers chuckled under their breath, not as confident as before, but still enough. Evelyn didn't react. She simply unlocked the phone. The screen lit up softly. No hesitation. No searching. She pressed one name, held the device to her ear. The cabin fell into a silence so complete it almost felt staged. Even the low hum of the plane seemed to fade into the background. One ring. 2. 3. Then the line connected. A voice came through. Clear. Calm. Familiar. "Mom?" The word landed like something physical. Not loud, not shouted, but it echoed. Across leather seats, across raised phones, across assumptions that had just begun to fracture. Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief second. Not in relief, not in emotion. Just acknowledgement. "I'm on the plane," she said quietly. There was a pause on the other end, short but heavy. "You boarded already?" the voice asked. Evelyn looked around the cabin. At Lauren, at Daniel, at the officers, at the passengers who had watched. "Yes," she said, "but there seems to be some confusion." The room didn't breathe. No one moved. Because now, they were listening. Not casually, not passively, but fully. "What kind of confusion?" the voice asked. Evelyn's tone didn't change. "They say this seat isn't for me." The silence that followed stretched. Not empty. Charged. On the other end of the call, something shifted. It wasn't audible, but it was felt. "How long have you been there?" the voice asked. "A few minutes," Evelyn replied. Another pause. Then, "Stay where you are." 3 words. Simple, controlled, final. The line went quiet for a second, as if something else was happening beyond it. Then, "I'm calling the captain," the voice added. And just like that, the balance of the room broke. Not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably. Lauren blinked, her expression tightening. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Evelyn lowered the phone. "He'll call," she said. That was all. No explanation. No name. Just certainty. Daniel's posture shifted again. Not dramatically. "But enough, ma'am," he said carefully. "Who exactly did you just speak to?" Evelyn met his gaze. "My son." The words were simple, but they didn't settle simply, because they didn't answer the real question, and everyone knew it. Lauren let out a short laugh. "Your son," she repeated. "And he's going to call the captain?" Her tone carried disbelief, but it didn't carry confidence anymore. Evelyn didn't respond. She didn't need to, because something else was already happening. At the front of the cabin, a faint chime sounded, soft, routine, the kind of sound no one usually pays attention to. But now, every head turned. The intercom clicked. Static. Then, the captain's voice came through, calm, measured, but different than before. "Daniel," he said, not addressing the passengers, not making an announcement, calling him directly. A private line made public by the silence in the room. Daniel stepped closer to the panel, his expression tightening. "Yes, Captain?" There was a pause. Then, "Step into the cockpit. Now." The tone wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent in the way panic sounds. It was something else. Controlled urgency. The kind that doesn't repeat itself. Daniel glanced back once. At Evelyn. At the passengers. At Lauren. Then turned and moved quickly toward the front. The door opened. Closed. And just like that, he was gone. The cabin remained. But it wasn't the same cabin anymore. Because now, something had reached beyond it. Beyond assumptions. Beyond appearances. Beyond everything they thought they understood. Lauren stood frozen for a moment, her composure slipping just enough to show it. "What is this?" she said, almost to herself. No one answered, because no one knew. The officers exchanged a brief glance. One of them lowered his hand slightly from his belt. Not fully, but enough. Evelyn returned the phone to her bag, her movements calm, unhurried, as if nothing unusual had just happened, as if the room hadn't just tilted on its axis. She didn't sit, didn't move. She simply stood where she was, waiting. The passengers shifted again, but this time, it wasn't comfort. It wasn't agreement. It was uncertainty. A woman in the front row leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who is she?" she asked. No one answered. Because now, that question mattered more than anything else. Lauren turned back toward Evelyn, her voice tight. "This doesn't change anything," she said. "We still have procedures." Evelyn looked at her, and for the first time, there was something different in her eyes. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something quieter, something stronger. "You're right," she said. The words caught Lauren off guard, because they sounded like agreement, but they weren't. "Procedures matter," Evelyn continued softly. A pause. Then, "So does getting them right." The cabin fell silent again. But this time, it wasn't the same silence. It wasn't passive. It wasn't comfortable. It was waiting. Because something had already been set in motion. Something that no one in that room could stop now. And as the seconds ticked by, A realization began to take shape. The story they thought they were watching wasn't the real story at all, and whatever came next was going to prove it. The cockpit door stayed closed longer than it should have. Not by much, just a few seconds. But in a room already stretched thin by tension, those seconds felt different, measured, heavy, the kind of silence that tells you something is happening out of sight, something important, something irreversible. Lauren stood frozen near the aisle, her arms still crossed, but the confidence that had held her steady minutes ago was no longer fully intact. She kept glancing toward the cockpit, then back at Evelyn, then away again, as if trying to piece together a version of reality that still made sense. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, though no one seemed to pick it up anymore, because the room wasn't listening to her. Not now, not like before. The officers shifted slightly, their posture still firm but no longer aggressive. One of them adjusted his stance, stepping half an inch back instead of forward. A small movement, but noticeable, because now nothing was automatic. Everything was reconsidered. Evelyn stood quietly near the front, her hands resting lightly against her sides. She hadn't said another word, hadn't moved, hadn't needed to, because the moment had moved for her. The passengers watched, but not the same way, no longer leaning forward with judgment. Now, with uncertainty. A woman in the first row lowered her sunglasses completely, resting them in her lap. Her eyes stayed on Evelyn, studying her like she was seeing something new for the first time. A man across the aisle leaned back, exhaling slowly, as if trying to distance himself from the version of events he had silently agreed to earlier. The phones were still there, but they weren't raised as high. They weren't capturing certainty anymore. They were capturing doubt. The cockpit door opened, quietly. Daniel stepped out. But something about him had changed. Not visibly at first. His uniform was the same. His posture still upright. But his face carried something new. Not confusion. Not frustration. Something heavier. He stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes scanning the cabin. Not quickly, not dismissively, carefully, as if everything he saw now required more attention than it had minutes ago. Lauren stepped toward him immediately. "Well?" she asked, her voice tight. Daniel didn't answer her, not right away. Instead, he looked at Evelyn. Really looked at her this time. Not at her clothes. Not at her presence as a problem. At her. The person. And for the first time, he didn't look like he had already made up his mind. He looked like he was catching up. The silence stretched again. Long enough to feel uncomfortable. Long enough for everyone to notice it. Then, "Step back," Daniel said quietly. Lauren blinked. "What?" "I said step back." His voice wasn't raised, but it carried weight now. The kind that didn't need volume. The kind that came from something confirmed. Lauren didn't move at first, just stared at him, waiting for clarification, for correction, for the version of events she understood to reassert itself. It didn't. "Daniel, step back," he repeated. This time, there was no room for misinterpretation. A pause. Then slowly, Lauren took a step back. Not willingly, not gracefully, but she moved. And in that moment, the room shifted again, because authority had just changed direction. Daniel walked forward, stopping a few feet from Evelyn. Not too close, not imposing, just present. The officers stepped slightly to the side, without being told. without being asked, because something in the atmosphere had changed, and they felt it. Daniel took a breath, then spoke. Ms. Carter. The name landed differently, not as an assumption, not as a placeholder, as recognition. Evelyn met his gaze. Yes, she said. Daniel hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, as if choosing his next words carefully. Because now, they mattered. There's been a misunderstanding, he said. The phrase was familiar, common, often used to smooth over situations that didn't deserve more attention. But this time, it didn't feel sufficient, not even close. Evelyn didn't respond. She didn't correct him, didn't challenge the word. She simply listened, because she understood something he didn't yet. That this wasn't about correcting language. It was about confronting truth. Lauren stepped forward again, her voice rising. A misunderstanding? She repeated. Daniel, she... Lauren, he said. Just her name. Nothing else, but it stopped her, because there was something in it she hadn't heard before. Not irritation, not annoyance, distance. And for the first time, she felt it, really felt it. Daniel turned slightly, addressing the officers now. That won't be necessary, he said. The words were simple, but they carried a clear instruction. The officers nodded. One of them took a small step back, then another. The tension around their presence dissolved, not completely, but enough. Because the direction had changed. Lauren stared at Daniel, her disbelief no longer hidden. You're just going to let her stay? She asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked back at Evelyn, at the calm, at the stillness, at the dignity that had never left her, even when everything else tried to strip it away. Then he spoke. She was never supposed to leave. The sentence landed like something final, something undeniable. A quiet ripple moved through the cabin, because now it was clear. The story had flipped, not partially, not uncertainly, completely. A man in the second row sat up straighter, his expression tightening. The woman beside him lowered her gaze, her fingers curling around her bung. The weight of what had just happened began to settle, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. Lauren shook her head, her voice cracking slightly at the edges. That doesn't make any sense, she said. You saw her. You saw... I saw what I chose to see, Daniel interrupted. Another pause. Because that was different. That was not a correction. That was an admission. And it changed everything. Evelyn watched him, not with triumph, not with judgment. Just acknowledgement. Because this part, this moment, was never about proving them wrong. It was about showing them what they hadn't been willing to see. Daniel took a step back, creating space, not just physically, but symbolically. He wasn't standing over her anymore. He wasn't directing her. He wasn't removing her. He was stepping aside. And for the first time since she had boarded that plane, Evelyn Carter stood exactly where she was meant to be. Not as a problem, not as a question, but as the person the room had failed to recognize. And as the realization spread, quietly, unevenly, uncomfortably, one final truth began to settle over every passenger, every witness, every silent observer. This wasn't just a mistake. It was something else, something deeper, something harder to undo. Because now they all knew. They hadn't just watched it happen. They had let it happen. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It spread. Quietly. Like a stain no one wanted to acknowledge, but everyone could see. No one clapped now. No one whispered approval. No one laughed. The cabin that had once felt full of certainty now felt exposed. Daniel stepped back another half step, creating space between himself and Evelyn, not out of distance but out of recognition. He wasn't managing her anymore. He was accounting for her. Lauren stood where she was, unmoving, her arms no longer crossed tightly but hanging uncertainly at her sides. Her eyes flicked between Daniel and Evelyn, searching for something familiar. Something that would restore the version of reality she had believed in just minutes ago. It didn't come. "Say something," she muttered under her breath, though she didn't know who she was speaking to. Daniel didn't answer. Because at that exact moment, the intercom chimed again. Short, sharp. The cockpit door remained closed this time, but the voice that followed didn't belong to the captain. It was different. Lower. Controlled. Carrying a weight that reached through the speaker and settled into every corner of the cabin. Daniel Reed. It wasn't a question. It was a call. Daniel stiffened slightly, instinctively stepping closer to the panel. "Yes?" he responded. A pause. Then, "Who authorized the removal of Evelyn Carter from seat 2A? The name landed harder this time, not as a passenger, not as a situation, as someone known, someone recognized. Daniel hesitated, just long enough to feel it. "I did," he said. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. Measured. Then, on what basis? Each word was clear, precise, unavoidable. Daniel swallowed once, his voice steady but no longer certain. "We believed the ticket was invalid." Another pause. Then, "You believed." Not repeated as a question, as a correction. Lauren stepped forward suddenly, her voice rising as if trying to reclaim control. "Because it was obvious," she said, speaking toward the panel. She didn't have the proper, "Who is speaking?" The voice cut through her instantly. Lauren froze. "Lauren Brooks," she replied, her tone faltering for the first time. Another pause. Then, "Step away from the intercom." It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. But it left no room for interpretation. Lauren stepped back, automatically, without argument. Because something in that voice didn't invite resistance. It didn't demand authority. It assumed it. Daniel's hand tightened slightly on the edge of the panel. "Sir, we're in the process of verifying—" "No," the voice interrupted, a single word, but it stopped everything. "You're past verification." The cabin stilled again. Because now it was clear. This wasn't internal. This wasn't routine. This had moved beyond the plane, beyond the crew, beyond the system they controlled. "Let me make something very clear," the voice continued. And for the first time there was something in it that wasn't just control. There was restraint. The kind that exists right before it breaks. "My mother is not leaving that seat." The words didn't echo, they didn't need to. They landed. And they stayed. The room didn't react immediately, because the meaning took a second to catch up. Then, it hit. A visible shift passed through the cabin. A woman near the aisle covered her mouth. The man who had spoken earlier leaned back, his face tightening. Megan froze in place, her eyes wide, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and realization. Lauren didn't move. She didn't blink. She just stood there, her expression draining of certainty one layer at a time. Daniel's posture changed again. Not subtly, Not gradually, completely. Because now, he understood. "Sir," he started, but the voice didn't wait. "You will return her to her seat," it said. "You will ensure she is treated with the respect every passenger deserves." A pause. Then, "And when this plane lands, we will have a much longer conversation about what happened in that cabin." The meaning was clear. Not a threat, a promise. The line went silent. No goodbye, no closing. Just absence. And in that absence, the room broke. Not loudly, not chaotically, but completely. Lauren took a step back, then another. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out, because there were no words that fit. Daniel turned slowly, toward Evelyn, not as a supervisor, not as someone in control, but as someone standing in the aftermath of a mistake he couldn't undo. "Ms. Carter," he said. His voice was different now, careful, measured, but carrying something else. "Wait. He stopped, because whatever came next would not be enough. Evelyn looked at him, calm, unmoved, not because she didn't feel it, but because she had already lived through it. The slap, the silence, the judgment, the certainty that had surrounded her like something solid. And now, the reversal. She didn't rush to claim it, didn't step forward, didn't say a word. She simply stood, exactly where she had been, the same woman they had tried to remove, the same presence they had misunderstood. But now, seen, truly seen. Around her, the passengers shifted again, but this time, it wasn't discomfort. It was recognition. A man lowered his head slightly. A woman looked down at her hands. Phones dropped fully into laps, because the moment they had recorded had turned into something else entirely, something they hadn't expected, something they hadn't chosen. Daniel stepped aside, fully this time. The aisle opened again, but not to remove her, to return her. "Your seat is ready," he said quietly. The words felt small, too small, but they were all he had. Evelyn glanced at the seat. 2A. The same place, the same space, but not the same meaning. She took one step, then another, moving back down the aisle, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady. And as she passed the rows of passengers, no one looked away this time. They watched, because now they understood. Not everything, not fully, but enough. Enough to feel the weight of what had just happened, and the weight of what it meant. Evelyn reached her seat, paused for a moment, then sat. The leather didn't change. The light didn't change, but the room did. Because now, she wasn't sitting where she didn't belong. She was sitting exactly where she had always belonged. And everyone knew it. Even the ones who wished they didn't. The cabin didn't return to normal. It couldn't. Not after that. Not after the voice on the intercom had cut through everything they thought they understood. Not after the word mother had changed the entire shape of the room. Evelyn sat in seat 2A again. The same seat, the same position. But nothing about it felt the same. The soft leather beneath her, the dim glow of the overhead lights, the quiet hum of the aircraft preparing for departure. None of it had changed. And yet, everything had. No one spoke. Not immediately. Because silence, this time, wasn't avoidance. It was consequence. Lauren stood frozen a few steps away, her arms hanging at her sides, her posture no longer controlled or precise. She looked smaller now, not physically, but in presence, in certainty, in the way she held herself inside a moment that had slipped completely beyond her understanding. Her eyes flicked toward Evelyn, then away, then back again, as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same person. The one she had seen when Evelyn first walked in, and the one she now realized she had never really seen at all. Daniel remained near the front, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression tight but composed. He was no longer directing the situation. He was standing in it, a witness to something he had helped create. The officers had stepped further back now, their presence reduced to observation rather than intervention. They understood, without being told. This was no longer their role. This was something else, something internal, something deeper. A man in the second row shifted forward in his seat. He cleared his throat once, then again, like he wanted to speak, like he needed to say something to balance what had happened. But the words didn't come, because what could he say? Sorry for watching? Sorry for agreeing? Sorry for doing nothing? None of it felt like enough. A woman across the aisle leaned down slowly, picking up her phone, not to record this time, but to turn it off. The screen went dark, reflections staring back at her instead. Around the cabin, others followed, one by one. Phones lowered, screens dimmed, because the moment they had tried to capture had turned into something they didn't want to hold on to. Not like that, not anymore. Lauren finally moved, just one step, toward Evelyn, then stopped. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than before, not sharp, not commanding, uncertain. I didn't know, she said. The words hung there, thin, fragile. Evelyn didn't look at her right away. She kept her gaze forward, out the window, where the last of the sunlight stretched across the runway in long, fading lines. I believe you, Evelyn said. Her voice was soft, calm, and that, more than anything, made it worse. Because it wasn't anger. It wasn't accusation. It was understanding. And understanding didn't erase what had happened. It illuminated it. Lauren swallowed. Her hands tightened slightly at her sides. I thought, she started, then stopped. Because what she thought didn't sound right anymore. Not out loud. Not in this room. Daniel stepped forward slightly, not to interrupt, but to stand closer to the truth of the moment. This shouldn't have happened, he said. It wasn't an excuse, it wasn't a defense, it was a statement. Simple, clear, late. Evelyn nodded once. I know, she replied. The cabin absorbed it, because now, finally, the conversation had shifted. Not about removing her, not about verifying her, about what had been done and what it meant. The older man who had spoken earlier leaned forward again, this time more deliberately. Ma'am, he said, his voice steady but low, I should have said something sooner. Evelyn turned her head slightly. Not fully, just enough to acknowledge him. Yes, she said. No anger, no softness added. Just truth. And that truth settled deeper than any apology could. The man lowered his gaze, because he understood. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about timing, and his had come too late. A quiet ripple moved through the cabin. Others shifted. Some looked down. Some looked at Evelyn. Some couldn't look at all. Because now they were all part of it. Not just witnesses, participants. In silence, in assumption, in the space where something wrong had been allowed to continue. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly. "We're going to address this," he said. "Properly." Evelyn didn't respond, not because she didn't hear him, but because she wasn't waiting for him anymore. The weight of the moment had already moved beyond promises, beyond corrections, beyond anything that could be said in that space. Lauren stepped back again, further this time, as if distance might undo something that had already happened. It didn't. Nothing would. The intercom chimed softly again. This time, the captain's voice returned. Calm, measured. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, now addressing the entire cabin, "we appreciate your patience. We'll be departing shortly." The announcement sounded normal, routine, like any other flight. But no one in that cabin heard it that way, because nothing about this flight was routine anymore. Evelyn adjusted slightly in her seat, her hands resting gently in her lap once more. The same posture, the same calm, the same presence, but now, seen, truly seen. Not as a question, not as a disruption, but as a person. And as the plane began to prepare for departure, a final realization settled over the room. This wasn't just about a seat, or a ticket, or a mistake. It was about something deeper, something harder, something that didn't go away when the plane took off. Because the truth was, what had happened here was going to follow them long after this flight ended. The plane began to move, slow at first, a quiet roll beneath their feet as the engines deepened into a steady hum, the kind that usually blended into the background of routine. But nothing about this moment was routine. Not for the passengers, not for the crew, and certainly not for Evelyn Carter. She sat in seat 2A, her hands resting gently in her lap, her posture as composed as it had been from the very beginning. Outside the window, the runway stretched long and endless, bathed in the soft gold of a fading afternoon. Inside the cabin, no one returned to their old selves, not completely. The air had changed, and it stayed that way. A new flight attendant approached slowly. Not Lauren, not Megan, someone else. Her name tag read Isabel. Her steps were careful, measured, not out of fear, but out of awareness. She knelt slightly beside Evelyn's seat, not in submission, in respect. In her hands were the torn pieces of the boarding pass, every piece, collected, aligned as best as they could be. She held them together gently, like something fragile that deserved to be treated with care. "I'm sorry this happened," she said softly. Not rehearsed, not procedural. Real. Evelyn looked at her, then at the pieces, then back at Isabel. "Thank you," she said. Isabel placed the reconstructed ticket carefully into Evelyn's hands. Not tossed, not handed over casually. Given, with intention. The difference mattered, because now, everything did. Isabel stood and stepped back quietly, leaving Evelyn in her seat, in her place where she had always belonged. Across the aisle, the man who had spoken earlier finally leaned forward again. This time he didn't hesitate. "Ma'am," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of certainty. "I was wrong." Evelyn turned her head slightly, met his eyes. "Not for long. Just enough." "I know," she replied. The words didn't carry anger, but they didn't soften the truth either, because acknowledgement wasn't the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness wasn't something owed. One by one, the room began to shift. Not loudly, not all at once, but in small human ways. A woman wiped her eyes quietly. Another passenger lowered his head, his hands clasped together as if trying to hold on to something, he had just lost. Even Megan stood differently now, straighter, but quieter, like she understood something she hadn't before. At the front of the cabin, Daniel remained still. He didn't speak again, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't feel smaller than what had already happened. Lauren? Lauren had moved. Not far, just to the side. But the distance between her and everything else felt immeasurable now. Her eyes stayed down, her hands no longer steady. The uniform still fit, but it didn't hold the same authority. Because authority had never really been about the uniform. It had been about how she used it. And now, that truth stood in the open, unavoidable. The plane picked up speed, faster, faster, the sound rising beneath them, and then lift, a gentle pull, the ground falling away, the city shrinking below them. And with it, something else began to shift, not erased, not forgotten, but lifted. Evelyn looked out the window, at the sky opening wide, at the clouds stretching like quiet forgiveness across the horizon. And for the first time since she had stepped onto that plane, she allowed herself to breathe a little deeper, not because everything was fixed, but because something had been revealed. And that mattered. Her phone buzzed softly in her bag. She didn't need to check it. She already knew. Still, she reached in, pulled it out, and glanced at the screen. A message. Just one. From Marcus. I'm sorry you had to go through that. Evelyn stared at it for a moment, then typed back, her fingers steady, her words simple. Make sure no one else has to. She pressed send, slipped the phone back into her bag, and leaned back into her seat. Not as someone who had been wronged, not as someone who had been proven right, but as someone who understood something deeper than both. The plane continued its climb. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and in that quiet, suspended space between where they had been and where they were going, Evelyn spoke. Not loudly, not to anyone in particular, but the words carried. Because now, people were listening. You shouldn't have needed to know who I am, she said. A pause, then. To treat me like I belong. No one responded. No one argued. Because there was nothing to argue with. Only something to sit with. Something to carry. Something to remember. The flight would land. The story would spread. The consequences would come. For individuals. For systems. For everything that had allowed this moment to exist. But right now, in seat 2A, there was something quieter, something stronger, something that didn't depend on titles or recognition or power. There was dignity, unshaken, unborrowed, unapologetic. And as the sun dipped lower beyond the clouds, casting the cabin in soft amber light, a final truth settled over everyone who had witnessed it. Value isn't proven by where you sit. It's revealed by how you see others, when you think no one is watching, and maybe, just maybe, next time, someone would stand up sooner.
Because silence was never neutral, it was a choice, and now they all knew it. When Evelyn Carter said, "You shouldn't have needed to know who I am," sitting quietly in a seat 2A, that moment didn't just end a story, it exposed everything that had been wrong from the very beginning. This wasn't about power or status, it was about the cost of assuming someone's worth before you ever see their humanity. And sometimes, the hardest truth to face isn't what we did, but how easily we convince ourselves it was okay. So today, think about this. The next time You see someone like Evelyn before you decide who they are. Just both 1 second of awareness could be the difference between repeating that moment or changing it. Have you ever stayed silent when you knew something wasn't right? Or have you ever been the one no one stood up for? Tell me below. And in the next story, you see what happens when the person everyone overlooks is the only one who can solve everything.